My grandson Eli stopped wanting to talk about school around the same time my daughter Renata remarried. My name is Frank Delgado, 73 years old, retired Army Master Sergeant, and for most of my life I believed that silence in a child usually means something is happening that words feel too dangerous to describe. I should tell you a bit about how our family arrived at this particular chapter, because it matters for understanding everything that followed. Renata is my younger daughter, born 4 years after Claudia, always the more sensitive of the two as a child, the one who cried at sad movies and brought home injured birds she found in the yard. She married young, at 23, to a good man named David Torres, a structural engineer with a quiet sense of humor and an easy patience that made him wonderful with children long before he and Renata had one of their own. Eli was born when Renata was 26, a healthy, curious boy who took after his father's calm temperament more than his mother's emotional intensity, though he had Renata's same wide, expressive eyes. David died in a highway accident when Eli was 6 years old, a drunk driver crossing the median on a rain-slicked evening, the kind of senseless tragedy that leaves a family reorganizing their entire understanding of how the world works. I remember driving to Renata's house that night, the worst kind of phone call still ringing in my ears, and finding my daughter sitting on her kitchen floor because she hadn't been able to make it to a chair. Renata raised Eli alone for 4 years after that, working double shifts at the hospital billing office where she'd been employed since before David's death, building a life that was smaller and harder than what she'd imagined for herself, but stable in its own quiet way. I helped where I could, picking Eli up from school on the days Renata's shifts ran long, teaching him to fish at the same lake where I'd once taught his mother, trying to fill in some of the space David's absence had left without ever pretending I could actually replace what Eli had lost. She met a man named Grant Holloway at a co-worker's barbecue about 1.5 years ago, and I want to be fair to Grant from the outset of this story, because it would be easy to paint him as simply a villain, and the truth, as it usually is with people, turned out to be more complicated than that. Grant seemed steady at first meeting, a reliable job selling commercial insurance, punctual in a way that suggested genuine respect for other people's time, polite around adults in the particular way that put Renata's worried mother at ease during their first dinner together, which I attended at Renata's invitation, watching him carefully the way I watch anyone who enters my daughter's life. He remembered to bring wine to that dinner, and complimented Renata's cooking with what seemed like genuine appreciation rather than performance. He asked me thoughtful questions about my army service, the kind of questions that suggested actual curiosity rather than polite conversational filler. I left that first dinner cautiously optimistic, the way I imagine most fathers feel when meeting a man who might become part of their daughter's permanent life. But I noticed, even in that first meeting, that Grant had firm opinions about how boys should be raised, opinions he volunteered without much prompting. "Kids today are too soft," he said at one point, apropos of nothing in our conversation, while Eli sat quietly at the far end of the table, 7 years old at the time, still deep in his grief over his father, pushing food around his plate with more interest in the pattern he was making than in actually eating. "Back in my day, if you got knocked down, you got back up and hit harder. Nobody coddled you." I remember thinking, even then, that this sounded less like harmless nostalgia and more like a philosophy Grant fully intended to apply, a worldview waiting for an opportunity to become a parenting strategy. I didn't say anything at the time. Renata was happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't seen since before David died, and I've learned over the years that fathers who insert too many opinions into their adult daughters' romantic choices tend to push those daughters further toward the very relationships they're worried about, rather than away from them. So I watched, and I waited, the same pattern I'd fall into again later with Preston during an entirely different chapter of our family's story. Renata and Grant married 10 months after that first dinner, a modest ceremony at a botanical garden that Eli, by then 8.5 years old, participated in as ring bearer, walking down the aisle with an expression that seemed, to my careful observation, more dutiful than genuinely joyful. I told myself that was simply the natural complexity of a child processing a parent's remarriage, grief, and hope tangled together in ways too complicated for an 8-year-old to fully articulate even to himself. For the first several months of the marriage, things seemed to settle into a workable rhythm. Grant moved into Renata's house, took an active interest in Eli's homework and extracurricular activities, coached his little league team for a season with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. I visited regularly, our usual Sunday routine of fishing or working on small projects together, and Eli seemed, if not exactly thrilled about the new family configuration, at least stable within it. The shift, when I look back on it now with the clarity that hindsight provides, began gradually enough that no single moment stood out as an obvious turning point. About 4 months ago, Renata called me sounding exhausted in a way I hadn't heard in her voice since the weeks immediately following David's death. "Dad," Eli's teacher called again. "He says other boys have been shoving him at recess, taking his lunch money, cornering him by the equipment shed. He doesn't want to go to school anymore." "What does Grant say about it?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral, though something in my chest had already gone tight with an old, familiar weariness. Renata hesitated in a way that told me everything before she actually answered. "He says Eli needs to learn to stand up for himself. Says if I keep rescuing him, he'll never toughen up." I kept my voice level, though something inside me had gone very still, the particular stillness I remember from moments before difficult decisions overseas, the kind of calm that isn't the absence of concern but its concentration into something useful. "Has anyone actually talked to the school about what's happening to him, instead of just talking about what he should do about it?" Renata admitted no one had, not formally. Grant believed involving the school administration directly would embarrass Eli further, would mark him as a child who couldn't handle his own problems, a framing that, even second-hand over the phone, struck me as precisely backward. The child being cornered and robbed wasn't the one who should feel embarrassed. But I've learned that pointing out logical inconsistencies in someone else's parenting philosophy rarely changes their mind in the moment, especially when that someone is convinced their approach reflects hard-won wisdom rather than a failure of attention. The following Sunday, I drove out to Renata's house for our usual visit, the drive taking me past the elementary school Eli attended, a low sprawling building surrounded by desert landscaping that always struck me as slightly too beige for the amount of childhood energy it was meant to contain. Eli was sitting alone in the backyard when I arrived, not on his bike the way he used to be during my visits, just sitting cross-legged in the grass, staring at the wooden fence separating Renata's yard from the neighbor's property. I lowered myself down onto the grass beside him, my knees complaining the way they always do these days, a persistent reminder that 73 years accumulates weight in places you don't fully appreciate until you're trying to sit on the ground with a 10-year-old. "Rough week?" I asked. He shrugged. "The universal 10-year-old signal for everything is terrible, but I don't know how to put it into words an adult will actually hear. I've learned, over decades of both parenting and commanding younger soldiers, that direct questions rarely open the door with someone who's already decided that talking makes things worse, not better. Sometimes you have to approach sideways, offering something of yourself first before asking for anything in return." "You know," I said, watching a hawk circle somewhere above the neighborhood, "I spent 26 years in the army. You'd think that meant I got good at fighting." He glanced at me then, curious despite himself, the first real engagement I'd gotten from him in weeks. "Didn't you?" "Actually," I said, The best thing the army ever taught me is that the loudest guy in the room usually isn't the strongest one. The strongest ones are the ones who know when to ask for backup, and aren't ashamed to do it. Eli was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I wondered if I'd pushed too directly after all, misjudged the careful sideways approach I'd intended. Then, very softly, staring at a spot in the grass rather than at me, he told me everything, the words coming out in a rush once they finally started, as though a dam that had been holding for weeks had suddenly given way. 3 boys, led by a kid named Tyler Briggs, had been cornering him near the equipment shed for weeks. It had started with shoving, escalated to taking his lunch money, and just that Friday, Tyler had grabbed his backpack and thrown it into the mud while 2 teachers stood 20 feet away, distracted by an argument between other students on the far side of the playground. "Does your mom know all of it?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady and unhurried as I could manage, though something inside me had begun burning with a particular controlled anger I recognized from years ago, the kind that gets more dangerous the calmer it feels. "Some of it," he said. "Grant says if I tell more, it'll make things worse. Says boys handle stuff themselves." I felt something old and controlled settle into my chest, the same calm that used to arrive right before difficult decisions overseas, the sensation of a problem crystallizing into something I understood how to address. "Eli, listen to me carefully," I said, turning to face him more directly. "Asking for help isn't the opposite of being strong. It's part of it. The strongest men I ever served with were the first ones to call for backup when something was genuinely dangerous, because pretending you don't need help gets people hurt, sometimes badly. That's not weakness. That's the difference between someone who survives difficult situations and someone who doesn't." He looked at me for a long moment, an expression I recognized because I'd seen it on soldiers half my age deciding whether to trust an unfamiliar commanding officer, like he was weighing whether to believe an old man's words against the daily reality of a man currently living in his house telling him something different. That evening, over coffee at Renata's kitchen table after Eli had gone to bed, I told her everything Eli had shared with me in the backyard. Her face went through several stages of emotion I remembered from years earlier, when she was younger and the world still had the capacity to genuinely surprise her, disbelief giving way to something harder, something I recognized as the particular fury of a parent realizing they'd been managed away from a truth that mattered. Grant walked in halfway through our conversation, catching the tail end of it, his keys still in his hand from wherever he'd been that evening, a work dinner with a client he'd mentioned earlier in the week. "Frank, with respect," he said, setting his keys down on the counter with more force than the action required, "I think you're overstepping. This is a parenting decision Renata and I are handling together." "I understand it's your household," I said, keeping my voice level, the same controlled calm I'd used with Preston months earlier, a tone I'd learned tends to unsettle people more than raised voices ever do, because it suggests a confidence that doesn't need volume to assert itself. But Eli described being cornered and having his belongings thrown in the mud while faculty stood 20 feet away. That's not a character-building moment, Grant. That's a safety failure the school needs to address immediately, and it's been going on for weeks while you've been telling him to handle it himself. Grant's jaw tightened visibly. "And what exactly is your solution?" stormed the school, demanding action like it's a military operation. "No," I said. "My solution is that tomorrow morning, Renata calls the principal, requests a formal meeting, and documents every incident in writing, with dates and specifics. That's not a military operation, Grant. That's called advocating for your child, which happens to be every parent's actual job, regardless of how tough you think it made you feel to handle things alone as a kid." Renata looked between the two of us for a long moment before finally speaking, her voice carrying a firmness I recognized from her own childhood, the same stubborn quality that had made her insist on saving every injured bird she found. "Grant, I should have called the school weeks ago. I let you convince me that doing nothing was somehow tougher than doing something, and I'm not doing that anymore." Grant's expression shifted, the confidence I'd watched him wear like armor for nearly 2 years finally cracking slightly at the edges. I just didn't want him growing up soft. My own father never coddled me, and I turned out fine. "He's not soft," I said quietly, choosing my words carefully because I sensed this was a moment that could either open a door or slam one shut permanently, and I wanted, despite everything, to leave room for Grant to eventually walk through it if he chose to. He's 10 years old, and he's been afraid to walk near the equipment shed at recess for over a month, and nobody with the actual power to fix that has been listening to him. That's not about softness, Grant. That's about a kid who needed an adult to take him seriously, and instead got a philosophy lecture about toughness. The kitchen went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and, somewhere down the hallway, the faint sound of Eli's nightlight clicking on its automatic timer. Grant stood there for a long moment, his hands still resting on his keys, and I watched something genuinely difficult play out across his face, the particular discomfort of a man realizing that a belief he'd carried his entire adult life, inherited wholesale from his own father without much examination, might have caused real harm rather than building the character he'd intended. The following week unfolded with a deliberateness I recognized from watching Renata organize things as a teenager, methodical in a way that suggested she'd finally stopped second-guessing her own instincts. She called Eli's elementary school first thing Monday morning and requested a meeting with the principal, a woman named Dr. Patricia Alvarez who'd run the school for 11 years and had, according to what Renata later told me, a reputation among parents for taking concerns seriously once they were formally raised, though the informal, playground-level incidents rarely reached her desk unless someone specifically escalated them. I offered to attend that meeting alongside Renata, and after a brief hesitation, she accepted, telling me later that having someone else in the room who could speak clearly about specifics, without the emotional weight a parent inevitably carries, helped keep the conversation focused on facts rather than devolving into either defensiveness from the school or overwhelming distress from her own end. Dr. Alvarez, to her credit, listened carefully as Renata laid out a written timeline I'd helped her compile the previous evening, dates, times, specific incidents Eli had described, cross-referenced against the 2 occasions his teacher, a young woman named Ms. Ferris, had already called home about some friction on the playground, language that had, in retrospect, dramatically understated what was actually happening. "I want to be direct with you both," Dr. Alvarez said, reviewing the timeline with an expression that suggested genuine concern rather than institutional defensiveness. "We have security cameras covering most of the playground, including the area near the equipment shed, though I'll be honest that blind spot has been a known issue we've been slow to address because the budget for additional camera coverage has been tied up in a facilities request for over a year. I'm going to personally review footage from every date on this list before the end of today." That review, conducted that same afternoon with Renata present at Dr. Alvarez's invitation, confirmed everything Eli had described and then some. The footage showed, across 4 separate dates, Tyler Briggs and 2 other boys, whose names Renata later learned were Marcus Webb and Dante Alvarado, cornering Eli near the equipment shed during recess periods when supervising staff were positioned on the opposite side of the playground, a blind spot both in terms of physical camera coverage and, more troublingly, in terms of where recess monitors typically stationed themselves. The footage from the previous Friday showed clearly what Eli had described, Tyler grabbing his backpack and throwing it into a puddle formed by a recent irrigation cycle, while Marcus and Dante laughed, all of this occurring while two teachers stood roughly 20 feet away, fully absorbed in mediating an unrelated dispute between two girls over a jump rope. Dr. Alvarez called Renata that evening, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine distress. "Mrs. Torres, I owe you and Eli a real apology. This should never have gone on this long without intervention from our staff, and I take responsibility for that as the person ultimately accountable for what happens on this campus. I've already spoken with Tyler, Marcus, and Dante's parents this afternoon, and all three boys are facing suspension pending a full disciplinary review by our district's Student Conduct Board. I'm also implementing additional recess supervision near the equipment shed starting tomorrow, and reviewing whether we need to petition the district for that camera coverage upgrade immediately rather than waiting on the normal budget cycle." There was, I should mention, a subplot to this story that I only learned the full details of some weeks later, one involving Tyler Briggs himself, the boy who'd led the group targeting Eli. I want to include it here because I think it matters, not as an excuse for what he did, but as context that shaped how this entire situation eventually resolved in a way I found genuinely more meaningful than simple punishment would have provided. Tyler's parents, it turned out, were in the middle of an unusually contentious divorce, one that had been dragging through family court for the better part of a year, involving custody disputes that had left Tyler shuttling between two households on a schedule that changed frequently and unpredictably. His father, according to what emerged during the school's disciplinary process, had taken to telling Tyler, in language uncomfortably similar to what Grant had told Eli, that showing weakness or emotion was something to be ashamed of, a philosophy Tyler's father had apparently adopted with particular intensity during the divorce as his own way of coping with feeling like he was losing control of his family life. Tyler, in other words, had been absorbing a nearly identical message to the one Grant had been giving Eli: boys don't show weakness, boys don't ask for help, boys handle things themselves, and had responded to his own household's instability by exerting control somewhere he could, over a smaller, gentler classmate who reminded him, according to the school counselor's eventual assessment, of vulnerabilities in himself he'd been taught to despise. I share this not to excuse what Tyler did to my grandson, because bullying causes real harm regardless of the bully's own circumstances, and Eli's fear and humiliation were entirely real and entirely valid regardless of what was happening in Tyler's home. But I share it because it became, unexpectedly, part of how this story resolved in a way that mattered to everyone involved, including, eventually, to Grant. The school's disciplinary board, meeting the following week, suspended Tyler for 5 days, Marcus and Dante for 3 days each given their more peripheral involvement, and mandated all three boys attend a series of sessions with the school counselor, a thoughtful man named Mr. Okafor who specialized in what he called restorative conflict resolution, an approach that went beyond simple punishment to actually address the underlying patterns driving the behavior. Renata attended a portion of these sessions, at Mr. Okafor's invitation, alongside Eli, and it was during the second session, about 2 weeks after the initial disciplinary meeting, that Tyler, prompted by Mr. Okafor's careful, patient questioning, said something that Renata later described to me as the moment she finally understood the full shape of what had been happening. "I don't actually hate you," Tyler told Eli, according to Renata's account, staring at the floor rather than at Eli directly. I don't know, everything at home feels like it's falling apart and nobody lets me talk about it, so I guess I wanted someone else to feel small too. I want to be careful here not to paint this as a simple, tidy resolution, because reconciliation between children who've experienced real harm doesn't work that way, and Eli, understandably, remained wary of Tyler for a long while after the session, not ready to simply forgive and move forward on anyone else's timeline but his own. But something shifted in how Eli understood what had happened to him, a recognition that Tyler's cruelty had come from his own pain rather than from something fundamentally wrong with Eli himself, a distinction that mattered enormously to a 10-year-old's developing sense of self-worth. Grant's own transformation, if I can call it that, unfolded more gradually and less dramatically than a single scene could capture, which is, I think, how most genuine change in adults actually happens, not through a single epiphany but through an accumulation of smaller moments that slowly reshape a person's instincts. I noticed the first real shift about 3 weeks after our confrontation in Renata's kitchen, during one of my regular Sunday visits. I arrived to find Grant sitting on the back porch with Eli, both of them working on what appeared to be a model airplane kit, Grant's usual confident, directive tone replaced by something more collaborative, asking Eli's opinion about which pieces to attach next rather than simply directing the process. "How's the recess situation?" I asked Grant later, once Eli had gone inside for a snack, giving us a rare moment of private conversation. Grant was quiet for a moment, turning a small model airplane propeller between his fingers. "Better. The extra supervision seems to be helping, and Tyler's, well, apparently he's been different toward Eli since those counseling sessions. Renata told me some of what came out in those meetings, about what's going on in his home." "That surprised you," I observed, not quite a question. "Yeah," Grant admitted. "I think I'd built this whole idea in my head of some kid who was just naturally cruel, someone Eli needed to learn to stand up to through sheer toughness. Finding out he's a scared kid whose own dad is telling him the same things I was telling Eli, that his parents' divorce has him feeling like he's got no control over anything, that's harder to just write off as kids need to toughen up." He set the propeller down carefully. "My dad used to tell me the same stuff, you know. Don't cry, don't ask for help, handle it yourself or people will think you're weak." I never really questioned whether that was actually good advice or just what got repeated to me until I believed it. I guess I just kept the tape running without checking if it was true. I didn't say much in response to that, because I sensed Grant needed the space to sit with that realization himself rather than have me confirm or elaborate on it. But I told him, eventually, something I'd come to understand over my own decades of both military service and fatherhood. Toughness has its place, Grant. I spent 26 years around some of the toughest men this country produces. But every single one of the genuinely strong ones, not the loud ones, the actually strong ones, knew exactly when toughness was the wrong tool for the situation. Knowing when to ask for backup isn't the absence of toughness. It's what separates people who survive difficult things from people who get quietly destroyed by them while insisting they're fine. About 2 months later, Eli called me on a Saturday morning, his voice brighter than I'd heard it in what felt like a very long time. "Grandpa Frank, I told the counselor about everything, and Tyler's not allowed near the shed anymore, and Grant helped me build a fort in the backyard yesterday. He said sometimes the toughest guys are the ones who ask for help instead of pretending everything's fine." Hearing my own words come back to me through a 10-year-old's voice, filtered through his stepfather's mouth no less, was one of the strangest and most quietly satisfying moments of my retirement. "Sounds like Grant's learning some things too," I said. "Yeah," Eli said, laughing in a way that felt easy, unforced, the sound of a kid who'd started feeling safe again in his own life. "He's not so bad, Grandpa. He just needed someone to explain it different, I guess." I've thought often, in the months since, about how differently this entire situation could have unfolded if I hadn't sat down in that backyard grass on a particular Sunday afternoon, if I'd simply respected Eli's shrug and moved on to some easier topic of conversation. It would have been the more comfortable choice in the moment, certainly. Confronting Grant risked real friction in my relationship with my own daughter's household, risked being labeled the interfering father-in-law who couldn't respect boundaries, a label I'd worried about with Preston 2 months earlier, in an entirely different chapter of our family's story. But I think about something my own Army training instructor told me 40-some years ago, during a training exercise where half the unit had frozen rather than call for backup they were embarrassed to need. "The mission doesn't care about your discomfort," he'd said. "If someone's in trouble and you have the capacity to help, your comfort with the conversation is the least important variable in the entire equation." I think about that lesson often now, in retirement, applied to circumstances my younger self never could have anticipated needing it for: a grandson afraid of an equipment shed, neighbors targeted by fraud dressed up as charity, the ordinary, unglamorous work of paying close enough attention to notice when the people around you are quietly struggling under a silence they don't know how to break on their own. Kids forgive faster than adults do, when the people around them actually change instead of just apologizing and returning to old patterns. I've learned that watching 3 generations of my own family grow up, fall down, and occasionally, with the right kind of attention and the right kind of help arriving at the right moment, learn to stand back up the right way. Renata told me, some months after everything had settled into its new, steadier rhythm, that she'd started attending a support group at the community center, one specifically for parents navigating blended families, something Mr. Okafor, the school counselor, had recommended when he noticed how much of Eli's difficulty had stemmed from unspoken tension between Grant's parenting instincts and Renata's own protective ones. "It's strange," she told me over coffee one Sunday, realizing that Eli's bullying situation ended up teaching all 3 of us something we probably needed to learn anyway, just through a much harder path than any of us would have chosen. If this story reminded you that real strength includes asking for help, and that a child's silence is usually the loudest warning sign there is, share it with a parent or grandparent who needs to hear it. And if it touched you, subscribe for more stories about family, quiet strength, and second chances that actually stick, not because someone gave a perfect speech, but because they kept showing up, differently, one Sunday afternoon at a time.